Welcome to the Solstice 4.0 Pod Gen3 overview and training session for customers. Thanks a lot for joining. I have to take a moment and just say I'm super excited because this has been a long story behind the launch of this product. Of course, we try to do a release once a quarter to keep up with this, sort of nascent changing market. But really, this story for 4.0 and the Gen3 platform started almost 2 years ago when customers started to say, what would be awesome is for your pod to become more like a room platform and not just the wireless sharing content platform for us. So we started to embark on a long journey that really found that we needed to add HDMI input for wired sources that couldn't hold a Solstice app. We needed to add dual HDMI out for rooms that are more sophisticated, maybe housing VTC systems today. And we needed to support 4K and things like that. So we really listened to the market, built a platform that would then take some very good software. And when you combine the two, you have what we're going to look at today, which I think is awesome. So what is it? Well, there's really two components to this release. It's different than our previous releases in that the platform itself now has changed to support not only just these features, but it also will support our roadmap for the next several years. So what you're going to see today is what you would think is, wow, that box is maybe overly performant. Well, it's there for a couple of reasons. One is we just believe in Moore's law and draw on, mass market adoption of very good compute platforms for our customers. But at the same time, that allows us then to build new features for the next several years in a market that's hungry for a single intelligent platform that defines how a meeting will unfold in the modern workplace. So let's look at Solstice Pod Gen3. This slide's really just kind of a high-level overview, and then I'm going to take you through live demos of all this stuff because that's the fun part. But let's start with just what it is. It supports a wired HDMI input on the front. That input can be up to 4K. So imagine now a occasional user that walks into the room and needs to plug. You can do that. We have many users that do things like, they're doing game development and they've got a PlayStation or an Xbox 360 or something they want to plug in, and they go and plug that into the front so it can become part of the Solstice experience. I want to talk a little bit here about why we're not a hardware company because we're talking about a box, but you'll see that as we start to talk about how the software drives each of these I/O ports. So you're going to see that in the demo. Dual display support. Again, it's really about what does the software do when you're plugged into two different displays. It's not about, now I have a big monitor. You have something more that Solstice can give you. It's a giant workspace. The box has 4K wireless streaming capability. And if you've heard me talk about this in the past on my blog, you'll know that it's sort of a pet peeve of mine. To claim 4K, you have to do two things, not one. You have to be able to sync and render to a 4K device, but you also in this space have to send 4K content wirelessly. The second of those two things is the really hard part. And we have that licked with this release. So I'm super psyched to demo that to you guys live as well. And then PoE Plus, which is a massive cost savings for infrastructure and deployment. So think of Pod Gen3 as a way to make your deployments way more flexible, way more low cost, because you're removing components that you used to have to put in place without us. So of course, then the corollary is the software piece, which is the Solstice 4.0 release. Solstice 4.0, of course, is also available on Gen2i platforms, but will not be able to support things that are related to the hardware I/O. Okay, so things like the Solstice Ink feature, which is really the end user facing feature of this release, the major anchor of this release, is our collaboration platform for anyone on any mobile device to do without having to get out of your chair to be able to mark up, annotate on the fly. And I'll show you that as well. Customizable welcome screen instructions in 4.0. Big thing. That was probably one of the biggest requests we've had from existing customers in the past year. We've also expanded our internationalization. So we now have support for 10 new languages. So I think that takes us to about 17 languages. And when I say language support, I don't mean the splash screen changes so that you get Portuguese on the screen. It actually is for the entire product suite. So our dashboard will be in Portuguese. Our mobile clients, when they connect to a Portuguese-enabled pod, will be in Portuguese. It takes you go all the way when you have to build these things. So it's important. The API, of course, is updated to embrace these new features. We've, of course, added more stability fixes into the product. And we've added some back-end stuff, and I want to talk about that later, the OTA update mechanism. Here's a sort of graphical view of the pod, front and back. So the top view is the back, where all the action happens for your room. You plug into Ethernet as before. Power is optional now, so if you don't need an extra power brick, you don't plug it in. You drive that over your Ethernet with PoE+. Audio out independent. And then, of course, there's now 2 USB outputs for USB 3. And there's actually some interesting stuff, sort of, I'll call it secret stuff in our roadmap that you'll see glimpses of right before InfoComm this year, that those extra USB ports are on the back for, and they support 3.0 and 2 HDMI out. So if you're plugged into one display, you get 4K. If you're plugged into 2, you get 2 at 1080p, 60 hertz. The front plate has the HDMI input, so it faces the user. Of course, if you're routing video to a table, you would just route it out of the pod to the plate on the table. And then that USB port, I mentioned the super secret, not so secret project. I'm sort of laughing because it's not that secret. That's there for future roadmap stuff. So if you're following our roadmap discussions, you can probably guess why we have that USB port there, but you'll learn more in the spring and summer about that feature. Okay, so here I want to just pause and make sure that I demo each of these features, because these ones are really compelling when you look at them. And I want to make a meta statement before we dive into the demos. So when you build software in this space, it's the software that should lead the user experience and not the hardware. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, if I added a second, like a wired input, and it acts like a video switch, that would be kind of a hardware approach. It would be when I plug in my Linux laptop or a non-standard source, or an occasional user decides they don't want to do anything on their laptop but plug in because they don't understand that the wireless era is here. They just plug in and Solstice disappears and the wireless, the wired source appears. But that's not how we built it. We really rethought these kind of components in light of a software-driven model. So really when a source comes in, it's part of the Solstice experience. You'll see that on dual output, and you'll see what I mean by 4K. So let's take a look at 4K streaming. I've connected to the display here in the room. Hopefully you can see that. So I've got dual display today, but I'm going to go ahead and share a 4K display or a 4K post from video onto this 4K monitor here. So what am I doing? I'm streaming a 4K file from this laptop over existing Wi-Fi to that screen. Now, of course, there's no hidden wires and all that, no bells, no tricks behind the scene, because we were doing this at ISE Live at a trade show environment, and it was huge. So that's a big deal. So 4K streaming, here I'll loop it so you can take a look at the quality. I'm obviously proud of what the team was able to do when we built that. That is native 4K. So if you talk to one of our competitors and they say, awesome, we can support 4K also, definitely ask the question. If I took a 4K grid, pixel on, pixel off, and I streamed it through your product to that screen, would I see a big, resampled 1080p display that got scaled up, or would I see true quality of a 4K image? I'm psyched that we've gotten to the point where we can now stream wireless 4K native. So let's demo wired input. That's the next on my slide. So I'm going to do that. I've got, now remember, we're in 2 display mode here. So I've got 4K already sharing off of a normal Solstice user, and I come into the room, and I've got a laptop here. I'm going to bring it up so it's not, hopefully its battery didn't die, yay. And I'm going to plug that guy in. What happens? Well, this post appears in the Solstice session just like any other post. So now I've got another laptop up here that is a live source. Now, can this source control what's happening? No, but that post is inside the Solstice session. So if I'm on this laptop, I could say, you know what? Let's look at that 4K display video right next to that wired input. That wired input is now on equal footing with all the other sources in the Solstice session. Okay, that's really important. It's not a traditional video switch. It's a smart switch that allows wired users to now act like they're contributing in the same way that Solstice users are wirelessly. Okay, so now I've got 2 sources on the screens. I've already started to demo a little bit dual HDMI out because I'm plugged into 2 HDMI, and you can already see there's something interesting going on here. When we built dual HDMI out, the question was, could we retain the user experience that everyone loves? Could we keep it the same, but allow you to sort of drag content freely across both displays? So I'm going to put more content up there so we can look at that. I'll share maybe this Slack video here or something, or a Slack app window up to the display, and then I'm going to put some more content on it as well. Let's go back to maybe throw a couple images on there or something. Okay. All right, so I'm posting content across what is now a big work surface. Dual HDMI supports 3 modes. It supports mirroring. So if I just have 2 confidence monitors in a conference room on both sides of a table and I want Solstice to drive both but be the same thing, so each team sees the same content, great, go into the dashboard, say mirror my dual HDMI out, and it'll be mirrored. What mode we're in here is extended mode, where the display itself knows where the edges of the borders are, but allows me to drag content across those as though they are 2 independent work surfaces. The reason that's really cool is we already had customers in beta say, you know what, I'm going to start using that second screen as almost like a parking lot for content that's about to be discussed, right? So I've got these new use cases emerging, and then stuff that we'll probably not get to, I'll just go ahead and put in the dock. So you can still drag content from anywhere on the screen into the dock on the left side of this big display. You can double click a post and say go full screen. If I do that on that 4K video, now everything flew into the dock just like it would have on a single display. But the first display, I can go side by side with stuff from the dock. Of course, if I drag that across the display boundaries in my UI, I'm now doing side-by-side comparisons. So I think it's an incredibly powerful way to sort of leverage all those pixels that, to be honest, are very inexpensive these days. These are 2 4K displays that are, consumer grade. They're awesome. They're not very expensive. So why not just start to deploy those pixels in your work environments for more collaborative real estate? Okay, so that's dual display output. The third mode, I mentioned there's 3 modes. So it's mirroring, it's extended, like we just saw here, where content doesn't necessarily go across the mullions, the edge boundaries, right? It's smart, knows to avoid those. You can also put it in a mode that's called seamless mode, where it will know, okay, this is a special use case where we're looking at really high-res maps or beautiful photography, and we want to look at it across the entire display at once. You can do that, especially if you've got like a command and control wall or these video cubes that have, almost no edges. That's a great mode to throw the system into. You just do that in the dashboard. Okay. PoE Plus, not an awesome demo to give you, but I don't want to short shrift it. If you plug in a PoE-enabled HDMI or a video cable, an Ethernet cable, it'll power the pod like we're doing here today, and it'll actually just take the higher voltage. So even if you wanted to use that as backup, you could plug it into a wall outlet, and if you lose power from your network, it'll continue to stay alive over the wall socket. Most of my users are saying, awesome, Chris, we're going to save $350 per room now because we won't run another conduit, we won't have to put another wall plate, and we won't have to deal with your big power brick, which is awesome. So those are some pretty amazing features. We're really going to talk about the USB port for now. Really, we're just going to stay tuned as a team, and we will slowly let you know as we start to build that feature. Of course, like we do with everything, you'll hear about it as it starts to come to life. So expanded language support. I'm back on the slides now. If you look at the full product suite, everything including apps, dashboard, quick connect web page will come across in the new language. I'm listing all 17 languages here so you can take a look at them. Of course, these slides are available after the webinar as well. Okay, my favorite demo. It's ironic because at ISE I almost forgot to demo it each time I did a demo, but it's the thing we worked on for the last 2.5 years, so you'd think I'd remember it by now. So Solstice Inc., what is it? Really, if you've heard us talk in past about the need to build a new approach to collaborative inks, this collaborative markup, this is our first piece of that. So we spent about 2 years figuring out why whiteboards really didn't take off in the collaborative spaces. Turns out they're just a 17th century rethink of a chalkboard. And that's not a very collaborative paradigm. So people have to walk to the screen. That's one. 2, markup that you make on content live. So I'll give you an example. I've got a Slack channel here on the screen. In the world of wireless sharing, if I wanted to edit this, I would do it at the source live so my team could see it. I don't really want to mark this up on top of it to keep it forever. Turns out that becomes a distraction anyway. So if I finger paint on this guy, I would prefer that to fade because I want to continue. It's more of a collaborative conversational piece of the collaboration experience. So I'm going to connect to this guy with this tool and show you what we built. So connect to North Conference. You'll notice that I can't show it to you well here. Maybe we'll add it to a slide later so you can take a look. I've got the app that you're used to here. I've just connected with a phone. You'll remember the Solstice experience is the same on every device, so I can control like I've been doing across both of those screens just from this phone. Can bring things in and out of view. I can double tap and look at them, make it go full screen, bring it back. Great. That works well. But we've added a little ink dot at the bottom. And what that does is it allows me to take the phone out of my pocket and already get a laser pointer on the screen. So right now I'm saying, okay, let's focus on this design drawing. That's pretty interesting. Let's talk about this guy as well. And I want to make sure that we maybe remove this part of the architecture. We're not going to use this. Okay. So when I lift my thumb up, that dot goes away. The dot's the same color as my meeple in the scene. So users that are participating with me knew it was me without me having to approach the display. Okay, that's already interesting because it allows that dot to be rendered even when you have a diffuser screen or glass when a normal laser pointer won't work. It also, and this is something you probably hear me talk about a lot, it's more engaging to use a device you're familiar with. This is the device you're most familiar with. It's your phone. So if you've got engagement issues in your own meeting culture, this is one way to get started on allowing people to say, I love this part, I'm not so interested in that. Okay, that was easy for me to do. Now the second part of ink allows me to slide that dot out, and when it's out of the dock, it's permanently on there. So I don't have to hold my thumb down, which is nice. I can just point however I want. But if I do tap down, I can do markup. Okay. Now you'll notice that circle there, when I circle that piece of the image, it leaves. And we did that on purpose because we don't want to create yet another distraction in the meeting. The idea being I might want to say to my marketing team, I love this, but this lens flare is really bugging me. We should get rid of it. Maybe we should be thinking about something more like this over here. Okay, so that's an easy way for me to do markup, and you'll notice it's already gone, and we can move on to the next point. The other thing we figured out is when people resist approaching screens to do the traditional whiteboarding thing, it's because they're not happy with their ability to do annotation. So if I have a jaggy line, for example, because I can't draw a line straight, you'll notice that we can actually fit that to a nice smooth line. So if I'm trying to underline something like this, it'll actually fit a function that smooths out my jaggies. Okay, so it's really an intelligent inking system that works from any phone that connects to a Solstice display, and any number of people can do it at the same time. So it's highly collaborative. You don't have to approach the screen and take over the meeting to do it. You use the device you're familiar with to do it, and it's natural. And it's actually, to be honest, in beta, we found that users find it fun, which is really cool. It's one of my favorite things, is that if people find it fun to engage with each other in meetings, you're in a really interesting place meeting culture-wise. So you can probably sense why I'm excited about 4.0. It's like a lot of platform stuff we did to get you guys, more flexibility for deployment, lower cost, better platform for your intelligent meeting, better meeting culture, and then an awesome end user feature for your users. Okay, other features I don't want to forget about in 4.0, we added customizable welcome instructions. What you can do is you can go in and edit your instructions. So, we show the IP address, we show, here are the steps, those are our default now. You can view that as a suggestion only. Go in and edit whatever you want in a document, cut it, paste it into the dashboard and say apply the custom instructions, and we'll replace that text box with whatever you put in there, which I think is awesome. It's been a huge request because we'll have end users want things like, I want end user specific stuff that you will never know about, like our tech support number in the online instructions showing on every conference room displays. The other thing we did is we made more efficient our ability to send you local OTA updates. The over-the-air update engine runs from our own house servers. But if you don't have pods that can see the internet, you're having to jump through some hoops. This will fix that for you because you can take our OTA package and install it on your own web server on-prem and point your pods at it and do an update. It's a much cleaner way to get to a very large-scale update. It's faster because you're not having to reach through the internet. You're on-prem doing it. And if you have pods that can't even be pointed at a proxy to reach the internet, this is the way to do that now. We introduced, of course, this piece in 3.5 dashboard getting ready for the 4.0 launch. But now that 4.0 is here, you can use it to do an OTA update locally. So don't forget if you need that. Okay, on to the more mundane pieces of the launch. Here's a chart that shows the pricing change with Gen 3. I'm going to be really transparent here. Some people think we're insane that the price only went up by $100 when we've added, 3 very sophisticated hardware features to the box that you're getting for that. But of course, if you've followed us long enough, you know that we believe that this should be a pervasive piece of your meeting culture, which means it needs to fit in all rooms, including low-end huddle rooms. I've seen our pods being deployed in hallways now, in transitional spaces. It's all about, your displays are now part of your infrastructure and they should be ubiquitous. Okay, so what does that mean really? It means that you can now get the pod for just $100 more for both unlimited and SGE versions. This is pretty important. Gen 3, it's not available in the non-enterprise versions. So if you need an enterprise version, then you still want to get a Gen 2i. But the reason we did that is these are very enterprise-specific I/O ports that we added. They're really for the enterprise, so we're not going to offer them in the non-enterprise edition. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And yeah, this is key. So what happens when we introduce new hardware? Well, we have a Gen 3 hardware upgrade program that you definitely would want to take advantage of if you see value in the new I/O ports, in the performance, in the 4K capability, then reach out to us and we'll get a quote to upgrade your pods, okay? So customers can definitely qualify for Gen 3 upgrade by basically buying Solstice subscription, which we used to call maintenance, but is now become called subscription due to its being tied to availability of Kepler and some of the other SaaS offerings that we're building. So if you are under a Solstice subscription and you extend it, or you're out of subscription and you renew it, that's going to make you eligible for a very good upgrade program to get Gen 3 pods deployed and swapped out your Gen 2s. So you have to be current, so you got to get current, and then you have to return your existing Gen 2i's. If you don't want to upgrade, of course, Gen 2i's continue to be sold and supported by us. 4.0 works on Gen 2i. Of course, the 4K streaming and things like that just aren't there because of the performance of the Gen 2i pod. But Ink is there, the customizable instructions, the OTA updates for seamless updates, that's all available on the 2i as well. The only time you'll see those things diverge is when it's hardware specific, like those I/O ports. Okay, so a little bit of bookkeeping here before we kind of end, but there's a couple other Gen 3 changes I want to make sure everyone is aware of. Software maintenance, I mentioned, is now called Solstice subscription. That's minor sounding, but it's important when you're referring to it because it's everything. It aligns you to things like getting access to your Kepler cloud account and things. So as long as your pods are under subscription, then you have access to all of those things. Gen 3 power supplies and HDMI cables sold separately. That sounds cheesy almost when I read it out loud, but really what it means is that we're way more environmentally aware of what's going on. And if I go out into the field with some of our top resellers, no offense to them at all, they're doing the right thing. They'll say, thanks for supplying this 2.5 foot, whatever HDMI cable, but I've already spec'd, a much more sophisticated video distribution backend for my big customer, and I'm going to throw these in the trash. So I just hate to see that. I think it's not fair for us to continue to do that. We decided with the Gen 3 power supply not being necessary because of PoE, we are now going to sell those cables separately. So there are line items, of course, on our price list for the power supply and the HDMI cable if you want to continue to receive them. And then my favorite, it sounds funny because I focus so heavily on technology and futurism and things like that, but I love the idea that we have now gone to bulk packaging. What does that mean? It means if you order pods in greater than numbers of 4, so if you say, I want 5 pods or I want 8 pods, we will default put those in bulk packaging unless you opt out. Now, big bulk orders that go to places that have an individual box on every pod is really depressing, because all those boxes do is get thrown away, because it's a large deployment in a brand new building, and nobody needs a consumer-like packaging box experience for each of those pods. So instead, now you'll get a really nice, easy to unpack bulk packaging order shipped to you. Okay. So what are the key takeaways before we sort of end and take some questions? Gen3 pod platform adds support for a lot more room configurations. Of course, you'll find things like those telepresence rooms that have 2 displays. Now we can give you collaboration across both. Improved streaming performance. I probably didn't hit on this hard enough in this webinar. I showed you 4K, but I could easily have shown you 6 1080p videos or 6 1080p laptops streaming into that box. It's about 4x the pixel throughput of the Gen2i, and it also supports us for future developments. 4.0 are available on all Solstice pods, of course, and Windows Display software licenses as well, as long as you have a Solstice subscription. And then the new pricing that I mentioned, that's important to keep in mind, accompanying it. But it's really exciting. I think it's if you compare us at that price point and the capabilities we're able to now provide, I think it's pretty exciting. Hopefully you guys do too. So with that, I think, I'll say thanks for listening and also watching me give some demos. Let's take some questions, see what we got.
Great, thanks, Chris. It looks like we've got some questions here, so we'll dive right in. To start off with, we have a question about penetration testing for Gen 3. Can you let our audience know when they can expect to see that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Obviously, security is super important to us, and it's important to you guys as well. Penetration testing actually is nearly complete. So we, if you're new to the product, you'll want to know that every year, at least once, sometimes twice a year, we run a penetration test with a third-party company. And the goal there is to do everything they can to find a way to breach the security of the pod. I'm happy to report that it looks like early indications are that this is our cleanest report in the history of the product, which is awesome. And as usual, what we'll do is we'll upload that into our Citrix secure data room. I've got a security response memo, just like we do every time, for any finding at all, as low as they might be, even just for informational findings. That memo will outline sort of a summary of the finding, what we're going to do about it, and when. But the whole report will be available sometimes mid-next week. So if you don't have an NDA with us and have access to that secure data room, send an email over to Aaron's team or mine, and we'll get that taken care of for you.
Awesome. Thanks for the update there. A couple points of clarification here around some of the new features. Is the HDMI input 4K capable?
It is. Yes, absolutely. And just like always, I'm a little bit maybe overly transparent, but I'm going to tell you that's good. And the only bad news is we need to, in the 4.1 release, we'll do a little bit of catch-up work, because if you're plugged into a 1080p display and you plug in a 4K capable laptop, we will happily send 4K to that 1080p, which means it's getting downsampled. Ideally, that input would EDID handshake with the device and say, you're plugging into effectively a 1080p monitor, so let's have you go to 1080p so you get native. That'll happen in 4.1. But yes, the hardware supports 4K. When you plug in a 4K device, it'll be 4K post on the screen. When you plug in a 1080p device, it's 1080p. It'll go down all the way down to something like 800 by 600.
Great. I have a question here about dual monitors. Does Solstice support dual monitors when using Windows software?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, ironically, it's supported that all along. If you know about our heritage, we started in the multi, command and control wall space, like at the White House or the Pentagon and places like that. So on the Windows side, the software was actually built very first. If you have a multi-head graphics card and you can get Windows to see that as a single display palette, a big work surface, Solstice will launch on that surface. So we've actually, there's some pretty high-end displays that run Solstice, like at the ATF, that are 4x3 arrays, so massive display walls running Solstice. So yes, you can do that today.
Awesome. Question about annotation. Can annotation be turned off or limited to a moderator?
Yes. Yeah. So the moderator mode enables a user to connect, remember. So if someone wants to annotate, they got to connect with their phone. So the faculty member would invite that student in through the moderator queue and say go, and then they can start to ink. You know, and in a more controlled environment like a boardroom, you'd do the same.
Cool. Yeah. So said another way, the moderator can disallow users from using annotation as well, right?
That's right. Yeah, for sure. So they would issue a connection request from that mobile phone. As long as you don't accept them in, then yeah, they're not going to point and write funny stuff on the screen, or like I did at ISC this year, draw pictures over your head, Troy. Yeah.
Awesome. I have a question about performance on the client computer for smooth wireless streaming.
Okay.
Can you provide some just some commentary around what's needed on the compute device in terms of the client to stream smoothly and in high definition?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be, you know, if you think about the technology that's happening there, it's an interplay between the CPU's ability to send us pixels, our ability to use the GPU to encode those as a video stream and then send them over your Wi-Fi. Where we see the biggest challenges typically is, let's say I don't have a great internet connection. So I've got guest Wi-Fi, for example, and it's kind of Wild West. And I'm watching YouTube and I want to stream that to the display in the room. Think about the topology there. I have to pull pixels from the internet. I have to render them on the laptop. I have to read them and encode them and send them on the local network to the pod in the room. So you can get sort of hitchy video in some cases where, for example, YouTube itself is hitchy because I don't have a good internet connection. The CPU, we actually have code built in to not overdrive the CPU. So think about it like this. If I've got a laptop that's under spec, let's say it's like an old Core i2 or i3 laptop, like one of the old corporate ThinkPads, and it's just not going to keep up, we won't drive your CPU to 100% utilization and drain your battery and then have you up high jitter on the screen. Instead, we will back off the frame rate. So we'll bring it down to 15 frames a second if the laptop can't keep up. I hope that's kind of what that question was looking for there. And there are specs on the website you can go look at, minimum recommended specs for both business use case and video. So to be fair, 80% of the stuff that gets shared is business use case documents, PowerPoint, maybe a 3D application that gets rotated on the screen, but it's not, high bit rate 4K video. That happens for sure, and we need to be capable of doing that. But there's two specs is the idea.
And on the whole, I mean, is it fair to say that like most modern compute devices, most modern client laptops or tablets, we generally see those play video fairly smooth?
Oh yeah. You should be thinking, we're not a high performance computing solution for sure. Yeah, if you've got a laptop that's the last 3 to 4 years, you should be great. Yeah.
Cool. Next question, no surprise here. When will Gen 3 pods be shipping?
Oh, imminently. So literally, minus the giant blizzard that's happening today here in Denver, we've got about 2 days out, I would think. We were in the final testing loop. Just a little insight about what it means to release when you're enterprise ready and it's secure, and you'd have to have reliability and 100% uptime. That means that when we think we're done, we have to then put it in our enterprise testing lab. So that's a facility that has hundreds of pods on networks that are incredibly complicated, where we're turning on and off VLANs overnight, things like that. So as long as those pods survive testing, we'll probably go, the next day, or maybe early next week at the latest. So I think we're on track for a very, very imminent release.
Great. And then the next question is about the 4.0 updates as well. Same answer, right? We're going to ship Gen 3 and make the 4.0 software updates likely at the same time. Yeah. So as soon as we say go, you'll see 4.0 available in your dashboards for download. You'll see clients on our own website that can be downloaded. The App Store clients are ready to go. We just have to turn them on, and then the pods will start shipping that day with 4.0 bits on Generation 3 hardware. Awesome. Housekeeping question, will we be getting a link of the recording? Yes, we will send that out after the webinar, likely later today, maybe tomorrow morning. A question here about AirPlay on Gen 3. Do the new Gen 3 pods still use AirPlay to cast screens from iOS and Mac devices.
Yeah, for sure. That's been a really great partnership. We're beta developers with Apple on that, and I think it's going well. I don't think there's any reason to change that. If you've already got that built into your device and there's a use case where you don't want our app, for example, just an occasional user. I just got back from one of the biggest executive briefing centers in the world that uses us, and that's a key piece for those kind of spaces where it's not corporate users sitting down for an hour-long meeting. It's a 15-minute, hey, look at this on this big screen. So yeah, we'll continue to support that for sure.
Great. Got a question about Kepler here. Any updates noteworthy there? I think.
Oh, awesome question. Yeah, sure. We didn't really cover them because we were so focused on Gen 3 and 4.0, but you got to remember that every time we release a feature, it sort of floats all boats. Kepler will also embrace that feature. So data about that feature will go into your Kepler portal, how often it's used. I mean, a great example is the HDMI input. I mean, how great would it for you to know, you know, my users use wireless versus wired in my rooms now with a Generation 3 box. I mean, you'd be nice to know whether you can get rid of that cable altogether or it's being heavily used and maybe you want to do something different. So any of the features in 4.0, including the new Gen 3 features, like are you in dual screen mode or are you in single, that all flows to Kepler. Kepler itself has its own roadmap, of course. So it's things like, you know, we basically have surveyed you guys, the end users and our resellers, to find out what are the biggest pain points you have from a deployment and large scale perspective. And Kepler's job is to start to attack those one at a time in order. So number one, and this sounds funny, but it's logistics. It's like, hey, I buy pods every 10 days, and they're all out of their maintenance dates are all different. And it's very hard to do a maintenance update and renewal so that I have co-termed those dates all together in my big deployment. Kepler will actually, I think in the next few days, go live with a feature that lets you do that nearly automatically, which is pretty awesome. It takes you through the workflow, lets you pick what pods you want to renew. You can hypothesize, hey, what if I pick, you know, April 1 as my co-term date? What happens if I pick January 30th? And it sends an email to your customer success rep. You'll get a call, that all flows. You don't have to go into your dashboard and export all kinds of data about device IDs and have a big dialogue with us anymore. So that's step one. Step two in Kepler, you know, the next big pain point is software updating at scale. So Kepler will allow you to, it'll allow you to pick a date, like schedule a time when you say, for example, let's say I want to roll out to 4.0. You could pick a Saturday morning, you know, a week from now, and say, do it on all 200 of my pods. Kepler will do that for you, and it'll give you an email, a report that says, here's what happened and here's where you're at. So
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, some great admin type capabilities coming soon for
sure. Yeah.
I have a question here about the API. Any changes coming to the API? Specifically curious if the API will be available for use with the classic splash screen. Interesting question.
Yeah. I wish I was face-to-face with that questioner because I'd love to learn more about the classic splash screen use. I think our trend is that the classic splash screen eventually will get end of life, to be fair. Now, if that makes you panic, just send me an email and we'll figure out why, and we'll put whatever you're doing from the classic splash screen into the modern pipeline. A great example of that is the new 4.0 that allows you to do custom on-screen instructions, because we found that people were still using classic because they were customizing stuff on that side of the fence. We wanted to get you to modern. The good question about API, you know, we just had the customer council here live in Denver. It's a great, you know, yearly meeting we have to sort of review what can we do better, where are we at. One of the things we learned is the API has to become a true REST API, so that it will evolve pretty quickly over the next couple of releases. So things like when you ask for a configuration file to come back, or you want to do a configuration setting and you get this massive JSON about every setting, we're actually going to break that down into things like I can do /API/screen key and just get the screen key and not all the time zones the pod's capable of setting. So we're going to clean all that up. It's getting a lot of attention over the next 6 months.
Awesome. A question here about frame rates. What frame rates for video stream should I expect to see for 4K and 1080 respectively?
Yeah, good question. I've run some tests here, and this is subjective because I don't have, jitter analysis or latency on my own network and things like that to correspond to it, because it's going to be partly dependent on your network. In particular, we have a variable buffer that will add a little more latency if we detect high jitter. So right now, you should be able to get 4K video streaming from a 4K device at about 27 frames per second. Okay, so almost 30, which is awesome. That means, to be fair, that means that every 30 seconds you drop 3 frames. That's not awesome if you're doing drill well analysis and every single frame counts. But for most cases, 99% of the use cases, that's pretty killer way to have a meeting. With 60 hertz, we lock it at 30 frames a second. With 1080p video, we lock it at 30 frames a second. So you should be able to hit 30 rock solid from 1080p all the time. We don't let it go over, to be fair, because the box could do that, but we don't want to swamp your network. And I don't want to degrade quality and things like that. So you could have 4 1080p videos at 30 hertz on the new hardware if your network is good.
Nice.
And we've got those network settings and things obviously in the network deployment guide.
Yep. Question about annotation. How many users can annotate? Can it be configured in the dashboard?
Oh, that's really interesting. You can configure the number of users that can connect. So that's an implicit way to change the number of annotators. But you can't explicitly say, I only want 1 annotator, or I want 6. You would have to use the moderator queue to sort of on the fly pick that. That's an interesting request. It makes me wonder what's behind that. But yeah, I'll think that one through. You could have lots. So some of our early tests, in alpha/beta, I had a university in the Northeast that was doing really cool stuff where they would put like a PowerPoint slide up and go, everyone in the class points at that they think that is the right answer. And it's almost like a voting scheme. And there were probably 16 users trying to point at the same time, which is kind of neat. Yeah, with all the colors and all that. So.
All right. Back to the housekeeping question. We have a question here about the 4.0 update, when it'll be available. It's not showing up in the dashboard yet. As we mentioned, it's imminent.
Yeah, give it a couple days. You'll get an email too, and that'll trigger you go into the dashboard and find it and hit go. But that's probably 2 days away.
Cool. Question about digital signage. Will digital signage ever allow overlay when source is full screen? Currently needs an HTML frame.
Okay. Sorry, let me make sure I understand that question. Digital signage with what overlay? One of the shares overlaying on it?
I'm a little confused now. Maybe we talked through just the configurability of overlay we have today. Yeah,
there's 3 ways to do it, obviously. So you could do no overlay at all. So when you drift into signage mode, signage is all you see. You can have the footer. So if you have users that already have the app and they just want to know the display name, or they need the IP to connect, that allows them to know it's a Solstice display and they can connect. Or you can do your complete overlay with video, with instructions to connect and the room calendar and all that stuff. And then the signage will play behind it. The only tricky thing is if your signage feed requires, if it tries to detect if we're doing stuff like doing what's called an iframe overlay, and they don't want you to do it, they will show black. So you need to test those modes. And that's really out of our control. It's something like, imagine if I'm the New York Times and I don't want somebody syndicating the New York Times within their own web page. I'm going to detect that's going on and turn off the feed. That's what happens with some signage feeds as well. So it's a little bit out of our control. To be fair, we have some work to do. Now that that's been brought up, I want to talk about it. Signage in dual display mode. Right now, it mirrors only mirrors. But if you're in a room with 2 screens and you need, on-screen instructions and you want a clean signage feed, clearly what we could do is give you an option that says signage plays on the left screen and your connection instructions and Solstice happen on the right until someone starts to use it, which would be a nice way to get around that iframe thing. So that's in the roadmap as well.
Great. I've got an interesting question here about networking. Will networking config change with 4.0? For example, firewall ports that need to be opened?
No, awesome question. No. Right now, let me make sure that's right. Yeah, there's no new protocol. All the stuff with inking happens over the standard Solstice ports. SSL, all that stuff happens through 4.4.3. So you should be good. AirPlay didn't change. No new ports needed. So that's good news for IT, I think.
Question about pricing change for Gen 3.
Sure.
Hit that again.
Yeah. So we increased the price by $100. Sometimes when I say that, people go, wow, that's amazing. Other people go, why $100? The reality is, when we added PoE, there's a transformer, a stepper transformer in there. We added dual HDMI out. Those components alone cost more than $100. We increased the price to try to offset some of that. I didn't want to make profit on hardware. That's not who we are. We're a software company. And also, if you really think about this market, there are millions and millions and millions of huddle rooms being built every single day that need Solstice in them. I did not want to create pricing headwind. So there's no reason for us to have said, it's a $300 price increase so that we can continue to see our margins and things like that. I think it's good news for the end customer and the channel because it just means we can get more pods into the places they need to be.
Absolutely. A question about if and when we will have multi-layered admin access.
Oh yeah, that's an awesome question. Yes, so let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen this year from the administrative back-end side of things. The dashboard was built rapidly on demand. That's not always the right way to architect a giant product like it's become. The dashboard is going to start to appear in Kepler. That's a more modern tech stack. The user interface is better. So things like software updating inside of Kepler, you could tell that's the first step towards dashboard configuration happening in your Kepler account. That'll allow you to do things like, get an email when a new pod comes online, so you can give it a name, but it'll auto set itself up. That's a great technology stack for those kind of behaviors to be built in. You'll see that happening throughout the year. So Kepler will take on more and more of those kind of jobs. I bring that up because Kepler is already, they've already launched role-based management. And we did that because we know configuration's coming. You could kind of go, that's weird. Why would I have role-based management in Kepler? Because it's kind of a flat set of, analytics and monitoring tools. That's because we know configuration will appear there, and that'll give you the ability to have users that are view-only, read-write access, super admins that can change networking config versus a local admin that might be able to repoint the signage at something different.
Great. We're getting close to the end of the hour here, but we still have time for a few more questions. One question here is about HDMI input. Will it be able to auto switch between Solstice and the input source, or is it strictly manual switching?
Oh, that's interesting. No, it's not like that. It's not a video switcher. So I maybe should have been a little more clear during the demo, but the way it works is the hardwired input acts as a Solstice post. So when we detect signal coming in on that, a post will appear as though a user is using our app and shared that source. So if you're, like one of our customers is a big media company and they have set-top boxes, and that set-top box needs to come to the meeting so people can look at the user experience of that. They plug it into the HDMI cable. We detect that automatically, and a post appears on the screen. So if I then come in and say, that's great, but let's look at the iPad user experience next to the set-top box, I can share content, and we'll be side by side looking at that data. So it's fully automatic. If I unplug the HDMI cable or take that set-top box out of the meeting, then it auto deletes it. So none of that's manual, just the plug event's the manual part. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah. We've had a few questions here about subscription.
Okay.
I just wonder if maybe you can give a high level of overview of Solstice subscription.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably not a surprise given we're a software company that we really think about our roadmap, the software, the services it provides as part of what we call now the Solstice subscription. If you have a Solstice subscription, you get maintenance, you get phone support, you get our roadmap, which is obviously being designed every day by these kind of dialogues. You get Kepler. So if you're under a subscription model, then you get all access to all those things. One thing that's changed around subscription, and this came up with the Customer Council workshop last week, in particular in higher ed and some environments, you have a CapEx budget, not an OpEx budget. because I was a professor. I know that when my grant runs out, I don't have any mechanism to continue to pay for a subscription service. So what we've done is we bundled that subscription service with a new SKU that lets you pre-buy X number of years up front and use your CapEx budget to just say, yeah, look, I want this room to be on the roadmap for 3 years and Kepler for 3 years or 5 years or whatever, and it's a single SKU purchase. So you get the pod and X number of years of that service. So that gives you access to Kepler and all the things I just mentioned.
Great. Well, I know we didn't get to every question, but I think we hit as many as we could. We just want to say thanks everyone for joining our Gen 3 and 4.0 overview webinar. We'll follow up with you with access to the video recording as well as the slide deck. And the 4.0 and Gen 3 launch is imminent, so keep an eye out for that email as well, hopefully in the next few days.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.